How are you doing today? Thank you, Richard. Thank you, BCL, for organizing this event. Harold, thank you for your kind remarks about Future 500 earlier. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us today. There is a ton going on this week at GCAS, and you are all very nice to share your time here to have fun with us. So again, appreciate you being here. Before diving in, I want to take a quick poll, see who's in the room. So who here in the room is from the nonprofit sector? CCLers, don't raise your hand. All right, pretty good representation of my sector. Government, any folks from government? All right, good. How about investors or philanthropists? Good. And corporates? Good. All right, some of the panelists didn't raise their hand. So I'm Erik Wohlgemuth. I'm the COO of Future 500. We're a service-based nonprofit that builds trust between corporations, advocates, investors, and philanthropists to advance business as a force for good. Our opening panel that you just heard, it was great, covered carbon pricing mechanisms and different strategies for using the money generated. Our panel is going to focus on what the business community thinks about this, as we know that business, particularly big companies, are a great determinant of policy outcomes, particularly here in the United States. The five of you here are leaders from notable companies who are addressing the risk of climate change in various ways, from internal carbon pricing, leveraging your procurement power to drive it through the supply chain, and through your legislative advocacy. We're going to want to explore what motivates your leadership to mitigate carbon emissions, and how do you integrate carbon considerations into your business strategy, and what is motivating or would motivate your company to support different carbon pricing policies. So I'm going to start with Christina. First off, thank you for hosting us today. Appreciate it.
Great. Well, I'd just like to welcome all of you on behalf of Gaap Inc. to this really important conversation and really powerful week here that we're hosting in San Francisco as part of the Global Climate Action Summit. So, thank you.
Great. So Christina, what factors are motivating big brands like retailers and like Gaap to find ways to reduce your GHG emissions? Is it consumer expectations, investor pressure, the Fisher family? What's really motivating you right now?
Well, I'd say actually all of the above, but we really see addressing climate change as benefiting our business by making us not only more efficient and reducing our emissions, we become part of something bigger, and that's really solving this really important problem. Businesses, we believe, play an absolutely critical role in this conversation. And as Michelle mentioned during her welcome this morning, we've set a 50% absolute GHG reduction goal for our owned and operated facilities globally. And we are not only working towards achieving those goals, but as part of it, we're adding renewable energy to the grid, which I think is another really important part of this conversation. She also mentioned that we, last fall, signed up for joined the Science-Based Target Initiative and signed up to actually set a Scope 3 emissions for our supply chain to really adjust that aspect of our impact. I think on the advocacy side, we're active members of Ceres and BICEP. We also joined the We Are Still In coalition, which is over 300 members strong, and that includes cities, states, academic institutions, NGOs like yourself, as well as businesses, to really stand up and say, we are still in and still support the Paris Agreement, even though the U.S. has pulled out.
And how about that effort to try to drive it through the supply chain? What are your big conundrums there and challenges?
Well, as with Scope 3 emissions, we don't have direct control, similar to how we have control over owned and operated facilities. We can make decisions that not only make good business sense, but also reduce that impact. I think with the supply chain, it's a little bit more complex, and we're really taking our time to be specific, considered, and set that baseline and really set a target that we know we can achieve in partnership with the several suppliers we work with globally.
Great, thank you. David, Exelon was a founding member of the Climate Leadership Council, so I want to hear a little bit more about what motivated you to do this and why support a carbon dividend approach versus other policies.
Sure, and let me just give you a quick Exelon 101 so you know where we're coming from. We're a public utility holding company headquartered in Chicago. We have traditional utilities in Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and our most recent addition was Pepco in Washington, D.C. So we've got traditional utility side, we've got a retail wholesale competitive supplier in Constellation, and then we're the largest generator of clean energy in the country by a factor of 2. We do that with a combination of nuclear power, wind, solar, hydro, and some natural gas as well. So really, if you go back to the creation of Exelon in 2000 with the merger of Commonwealth Edison and Pico Energy, carbon was one of the drivers from the very start. That merger brought together two of the largest nuclear utilities in the country. And we didn't get there by accident. It was a concerted decision. When John Rowe, one of our original chairmen, went to Commonwealth Edison, he was faced with a choice between investing in 10,000 megawatts of coal assets that ComEd had and selling the nuclear, or selling the nuclear and plowing it into the coal. And he opted to get rid of the coal units, even though he had come from New England, and plow the proceeds into improving our nuclear output. And he took that fleet from about a 60% capacity factor to today it's over 92, 93%. It's one of the best performing nuclear fleets in the world. And so these are just enormous machines that produce tons of carbon-free energy. Nuclear in the U.S. is about 20% of the energy mix, but 60% of the clean energy in the nation. So for us, this has been something that we've cared about since our founding. We were active in U.S. CAP. We were active supporters of Waxman-Markey. And so joining the CLC was kind of a no-brainer for us. John Rowe, who I mentioned earlier, first actually testified before Congress in a previous capacity in 1992, calling for a carbon tax. And then that advocacy kind of went dormant as we looked at cap and trade and other solutions, but I think we've kind of come full circle. And one of the reasons that we prefer the dividend is, as Greg said, it goes to the sustainability of the program and makes sure that it'll be around and won't be subject to the political changes in Washington. And the other thing, frankly, is given our customer base, when you look at Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and DC, we care a lot about the regressive impacts of a tax. And so if you look at the dividend return proposal, about 70% of Americans, over 70% of Americans are better off under a dividend proposal than any other proposal.
Great, thank you. Mary Ellen, you and I had a delightful dinner a little over a year ago, and then it touched on Steelcase's evolving carbon strategy. So you're part of RE100, you're big advocates of renewable energy, and curious since that dinner, what factors are motivating Steelcase to reduce its GHG emissions? Give us a little insight into what's going on in your company.
Okay, thanks, Erik. And I want to thank Christina and Gaap Inc. for hosting us, and also Harold and Steve for encouraging my participation here. So just a little bit of background information first. So I represent Steelcase, which is a global leader in the office furniture industry. And we're all about trying to transform workers, and workplace. And basically, the only way we can do that is by adding value for our customers and our stakeholders. And with that, you might wonder, why would I possibly be participating in a carbon tax forum? And the way we think of it is, it's a long-term game. We need more certainty. We need to be able to plan for the future. It's not a good situation for a business to be surprised. So we would much rather put up with the possibility of cost increases or taxes if we are well aware of them and can actually plan for them. So in terms of our commitment to greenhouse gas emission reductions, so as Erik said, we're a member of RE100, so we've committed to 100% renewable electricity for our electricity usage around the world. And that was a couple of years ago. We're committed to doing that on into the future. And we're also in the process of starting to look at setting science-based targets to make sure that for the future, our greenhouse gas emissions are in line with what would keep us, hopefully as a world and nation, below that 2 degrees Celsius increase mark.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nick, Exxon has actually implemented an internal carbon price several years ago, and several other companies have followed suit. So I'm curious about what impact that's had kind of on your investment decisions over the years, and what might be the impact of a national carbon tax both on the oil and gas sector and on ExxonMobil writ large.
Thanks, Erik. It's good to be here today. Thank you to the Gaap for hosting us in this lovely room. I hope I speak for everybody in the room that we're looking forward to seeing whatever chum you have available. We've got the air is getting crisp, and my fall wardrobe really needs an upgrade. So thank you for hosting us.
Bring on the questions, everybody.
And thanks to Citizens Climate Lobby, I've had the good fortune of participating in a few Citizens Climate Lobby events on the East Coast. So it's nice to see some old friends here in San Francisco. So to your question about the carbon price, just to give people a little understanding of how we look at this, we have an annual business planning basis that we do every year that's global in scope, which actually ladders up to a publication that we put out every year called our Energy Outlook, which I encourage people to take a look at. And what this planning process is designed to do is to give us, as a company that makes investments that are very long-lived, that can play out over 20, 30, 40 years, confidence in the decisions that we're making, in the investment decisions that we're making. And so as we do that, we look around the world, and for some time, I thought the earlier panel was terrific. The chart that was shown, you see what's going on around the world. So I think the original map went back to 2008. There wasn't a lot of carbon pricing globally. It was just in a few regions. You fast forward to today, and you see there's carbon pricing in much of the world, and I don't think that's going to change. I think that's good. You're going to accelerate that. So for our business planning purposes, we assume a proxy price of carbon in different regions. Now, it'll differ, say, in Europe as opposed to sub-Saharan Africa. But we impose that proxy cost on our business planning decisions so that we understand what might the effect be on demand. I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. Carbon prices, whether it's in the form of a carbon tax or cap and trade, a properly designed cap and trade program, will have an effect on demand for products. And it could have a dampening demand on for our products right now. It could elevate demand for David's products. So we do that, and that's what guides our investment decisions all around the world. That's how we look at it.
Great, thank you. Chris, so you're based in California, obviously. You've had a lot of experience with the state's cap and trade program, and how's that working for you?
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here, and this really is an exciting week. It's amazing how many events are happening all over the city and around climate action. So I'm Chris Benjamin. I lead the sustainability team at PG&E, headquartered just around the corner from here today. I think I had probably one of the shortest commutes. And we provide clean energy to about 16 million people throughout Northern and Central California. And, as a company, our sustainability journey is really linked with California's. And we're really privileged to serve customers in California, which, as many of you know, has some of the nation's most progressive climate and energy policies. Including a goal to reduce emissions 40% by 2030 from a 1990 baseline, with really aggressive goals around renewable energy, zero-emission vehicles, energy efficiency, et cetera. And the utilities in California are really partners with the state in helping to achieve those goals. And the state, as Erik mentioned, as part of that sort of portfolio of programs, also has a cap and trade program, which has been in place here since 2013, and it was actually recently extended to 2030, which we actively supported. And so we participate in that program, which sets a cap on the state's emissions that declines over time, and companies like ours have some flexibility in terms of meeting our compliance obligation through reducing emissions or purchasing allowances in the carbon market, or for a certain portion, carbon offsets. And the program is working, and I think it's just a great example of how you can put a price on carbon. And what we've seen in the state of California is we have reduced the state's greenhouse gas emissions over time, while the economy has continued to grow through a variety of different measures. And I think it's also helped attract a lot of investment here in the state in terms of low carbon technologies, which is a really important, I think, part of the story in terms of putting a price on carbon. So there's really, I think I just agree with all the other panelists, is that there's a really strong business case for doing this. One of the features of the program also is use of the proceeds that are collected, which last year I think topped $700 million. And those are supporting a variety of low carbon technologies throughout the state, including rebates for purchasing electric vehicles and plug-in electric vehicles, which is really, really important because as a state, about 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector. So that's a really important focus for our company and many others, is how do we transform that sector and get more electric vehicles driving on California's roads.
Quick follow-up there. SB 100 passed last week by the California legislator, commits the state to go to 100% fossil fuel-free electricity by 2045. Hope that wasn't a surprise to you. I figured you were involved in some of the making of that. So could you talk a little bit about how that's going to impact you going forward?
Sure, absolutely. It's a really important piece of legislation. And as I mentioned, we've long supported California's efforts around reducing emissions and bringing more clean energy to our customers. In fact, last year, we actually hit 33% renewable energy for our customers. Actually, that's 3 years ahead of schedule for the state. And so we look forward to doing even more for our customers. During the legislative process, we did express some just concerns about maintaining the affordability of this for our customers. And I think that's just really important, is as we make this transition and transform our economy to meet the challenge of climate change, how do we do so and make sure we do so in an affordable way for everyone involved?
Got it. Later today, we're going to hear a brief video from Congressman Curbelo and his proposal. And I know that Gaap was one of the companies, I think, that signed on to a letter encouraging the congressman for seeking bipartisan agreement on addressing carbon risk or climate risk. So I'm curious why. What is it about that particular approach that you wanted to praise publicly?
Well, I think it's in line with our policy advocacy and our work with the Series and Bicep Coalition. We also support bipartisan activity on this topic, and we felt that supporting Curbelo made a lot of sense for us. I think it's important where we can to step up and use that business voice to really add some wind to the sails.
Chris, you signed on to it as well.
Yeah,
Curious?
yeah, we did. And maybe just segueing there, we've got a really successful program here in the state of California. We've also, like many of the panelists here, I think just long supported the need for a federal, greenhouse gas reduction program. And, the way we think about it is in terms of principles, around a carbon pricing program, doing so in a way that is multi-sector, so not just the utility sector, but across the different sectors of the economy. One that prioritizes, as I mentioned earlier, the affordability and the impacts to customers, and also harmonizing a national program with successful programs like the one we have here in the state of California. And we did sign on and joined a coalition of a number of other companies around the Congressman Curbelo's recent legislation, which we think is a really positive step in the right direction. And I think it's helping, along with a number of other activities, including from the folks in this room, to get the conversation moving and get the dialogue moving around how do we get some traction at the national level.
Erik, if I could just add something on the Curbelo bill. I understand he's speaking here later today, maybe by video. I don't know if he's going to be here in person, but I encourage everybody here to listen to him, because he's a good example of what Greg was talking about in the earlier panel about some of the generational differences with respect to this issue. He's a younger member. He's a very sharp guy. He's very conservative. So there are things that are changing, I think, on the right side of the aisle And so I just encourage you to, if you have time and you get to hear him today, to listen to what he has to say.
Got it. Mary Ellen, one thing I want to touch on, we're talking about some of the national carbon prices, and you mentioned earlier how you're feeling your way toward it. Are there particular things about a national policy that you think could really motivate your leadership? And if investors or your customers really began to put more pressure on you, do you think that would be one of the things that could motivate you to get on board with a particular policy?
Yes, I think certainly the fact that our customers are members of the Climate Leadership Coalition makes a difference. And I think our customers like us are also asking for more certainty, more predictability. But in terms of a potential national carbon fee or carbon tax, what's important to us is to have as broad of a scope geographically as possible. It's very difficult when we're dealing with regulatory requirements that differ not only from state to state and, of course, country to country, but even from different municipalities to others. It becomes very expensive to deal with all of that variation in regulatory requirements. So, yes, if there were to be a carbon fee or carbon tax, we would certainly hope that it would be applied nationally with the border adjustments and, the other aspects that have been described.
A lot of questions here. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me? Sorry. A lot of questions. One is on cap and trade, which has strong constituencies both in California and the EU. I think this is a question for David and or Chris. And can that be overcome in favor of carbon taxation? I think there's some deliberation on what's the right policy for some folks, and I know CCL is very supportive of the carbon tax approach. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Sure. Well, it's ironic that cap and trade, which was a Republican idea, has been poisoned as cap and tax by Republicans in recent years. I think it's very workable. I think you have the same problem with the revenue side on taxes that you have with allowances on cap and trade programs, discussions about how to return those or allocate those allowances. I think it's definitely doable, but I think that a tax at this point just seems much more efficient, easier to administer, and gives you different options to protect the customer classes that are out there. So, if we could go back to cap and tax and use the Clean Air Act as a success story, where everybody in the industry achieved the targets faster than anybody anticipated and much cheaper than anybody anticipated, that'd be a great way to go. But don't see that on the horizon.
Got it.
The only thing I would say is that we support carbon pricing, and there's different ways of getting there, whether it's cap and trade or a carbon tax. If it's designed in the right way, with some of the principles that we've been talking about, then it can achieve the ultimate goal of reducing emissions and doing it in a cost-effective way.
Great. So Nick, as you anticipated, there's been a lot of questions for Exxon, so I'm going to try to harmonize a few of them. And as you know, we work with a lot of companies to advance their sustainability strategies in alignment with stakeholder expectations. And one of the biggest challenges we see companies face is aligning tone and deed. And Exxon's been very public over a number of years talking about the need for a carbon tax. But I think a lot of your critics and your skeptics don't see the actions or the deeds aligning with that tone. And so I'm curious if you can comment on that. In the last year, there has been a notable change. You pulled out of ALEC. The current CEO has been a lot more vocal about carbon issues than his predecessor. You joined the Climate Leadership Council. So what is different, if there is something different going on inside? What's going on in the Temple of Doom?
So come and visit and find out. So no, I wouldn't say that there's anything categorically different. What I do think our company has a differentiated approach on this issue in some ways, especially compared with our peer companies or competitor companies, which I actually think is appropriate, because I think if you look at this problem and you look at this challenge and the global nature of it and the scale challenges involved, I don't think there's one single approach that's actually going to, that's the only approach. Where we have chosen to focus our efforts primarily has been, and maybe it's less visible to some people, but has been in some of the longer range technology challenges. We actually see this climate change being meaningfully addressed with technologies that don't even exist yet. The current generation of technologies is not going to be adequate given the increase in global demand around the world that we can reasonably expect, and given the scale challenges involved. I mean, just a couple of numbers to keep in mind. Between now and mid-century, you're going to have 3 billion people around the world who are rising into the middle class. And it's the middle class, global middle class, that is the driver of consumption and emissions. You have 2 billion people around the world today who don't use modern cooking facilities to cook their food. They use things like animal dung, for example. There are over 1 billion people around the world who don't have access to electricity. So these are the numbers that we need to think about when we're talking about the scale of the challenge globally, not in places like California where we already have all of these things, where we have a modern economy and all the benefits of modernity. But we need to think globally about this. And so we have been focusing on long-range technology development in a number of areas because we think these are going to be the technologies that are going to be needed. On the flip side, on the policy front, I mean, as you mentioned, we've articulated support for carbon tax as the best approach on this. And I want to pick up on a couple of comments that some of the other panelists made. David pointed out that carbon tax is probably more efficient than cap and trade. And that's not an insignificant point because the costs involved are going to matter for the willingness of countries and societies to accept the costs to transition their energy mix, their fuel mix, and all of the rest. We don't have infinite resources around the world. So efficiency in policy is actually extremely important. And one thing maybe we'll get a chance to talk about is there's a lot of policy in place nationally, at the state level, regionally, and I think we should spend some more time thinking about, okay, is this optimal policy? Is this the right way of going about addressing this challenge? Because if you have policies in place that are very, very high cost, for example, but very low benefit, it might feel as if we're doing something about this challenge, but in reality we're not, or we're not doing enough. And so focusing on the importance of efficient policy is actually pretty critical. And so when we look at the suite of available policy approaches, that's why we have for a decade now supported a carbon tax as the most appropriate means of dealing with this.
Got it. A lot of questions coming in here. A few questions about nuclear, so I'm going to pivot back to David. And just in terms of some of the risks of dealing with the waste, some of the classic issues, people are concerned about that. They don't really think of it as clean energy, even though you defined it that way. So if you could touch on some of address some of the concerns that
Sure.
the audience have.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Every technology's got its benefits and its disadvantages. Nuclear does have a waste stream, but unlike other energy sources, I can tell you where every single gram of used nuclear fuel that's ever been created in the United States is. It's not in the ground, it's not in the air, it's not in the water, it's inside the reactors. Dealing with this on a long-term basis is not a technical challenge. It's a political problem, and we shouldn't underestimate that. But it's not a technical problem. We know how to deal with this, and other countries around the world are dealing with this as well. Some might argue that the U.S. focus has been a little too narrow, but there are a lot of options out there, and so yes, we've got a waste stream, but again, I think the distinguishing factor is that I can tell you where every bit of that waste is at this point. And I think getting back to the efficiency point, MIT just put out a study, the power sector last week, that said if we focus on the result, on eliminating carbon, we will get there faster and cheaper than if we try to dictate what technologies we use to get there. So whether it's nuclear, wind, solar, geothermal, whatever it might be, if we focus on the end result that we all want, which is a carbon-free power generation sector, we can get there faster than if we try to dictate how we get there.
So a few questions on, thank you, on how each of you are dealing with financial reporting and increasing investor demands on ESG. This question was specifically posed to the Gaap, so I'll turn it over to you, Christina, in terms of how important is this to some of your investors nowadays?
Sure. As part of the series network, 50% approximately are businesses and 50% are investors. And so we got a lot of investor insight through that relationship. I think one of the key signals that we've seen from investors is through the updated questionnaire. As part of the Climate Disclosure Project, we fill out that report every year. And one of the things that was new this year and that actually will likely lose points on is around financial modeling for climate-related risks. And I think we're not the only business that is going to have and face that challenge as we think about changing climate. We're a global company. A lot of where we source from could potentially be more impacted. We're a cotton-based company, and so when you think about the challenges of growing that cotton and the water used to grow that cotton, I think the risk related to climate is pretty big for our business, and we take it very seriously, and certainly are encouraged by the intelligent questions that investors are starting to ask.
Do you want to comment a little bit on some of the negotiations you've been having with investors on some of your reporting? I know that it's been a challenge to ExxonMobil to kind of move forward with that after the resolution, so I'm curious how that's been working for you folks internally with some of your engagement with investors.
So sure, there's increasing shareholder interest in this subject, period. I mean, there's no doubt, and I think that's true for every country, company, not just in our sector, but you see it even in companies where you wouldn't necessarily immediately think about climate change at the Gaap. We had a shareholder proposal that passed, which was asking us for additional disclosures in this space, sensitivity analyses, looking at things like what might stepped up adoption of electric vehicles mean for demand for your products, for example, and things like that. And I think it's appropriate that investors are asking those questions. We found over the course of the last year, meeting with shareholders both in the U.S. and around the world after we put out our energy and carbon summary, which is on our website, and I encourage you to take a look at it. We've had a very constructive series of dialogues with them. It's actually informing how we will be doing additional disclosures in the future. Disclosures are for those of you in the business community, you know this, but some folks may not be quite as attuned to some of the challenges there. It's a deeply regulated space, and so companies have to be very careful in what they say and how they say it. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do more of, it's partly just a resourcing issue, is just more one-on-one time with investors in the U.S. and around the world, both to hear from them what their concerns are about challenges and, quite frankly, opportunities for our company and the industry as it addresses climate change risks. We found that those kinds of engagements are actually quite constructive, and again, they feed into how we talk to investors about it, how we think about how we plan our business, and how we're thinking about the future.
If I could just briefly add, I think this is a really, really important topic, and like the Gaap and others, we've been reporting to the CDP and others for a long time, and there's a lot of value in doing that, because through that disclosure process, you learn a lot about your company. Where are the gaps? Where are the opportunities? And so it becomes just built into your program. We're also we're seeing the effects of climate change today. We're seeing it in California after years of drought, extreme precipitation, heat waves, of course the wildfires, and so we've been doing a lot there as well. Vulnerability assessments, trying to assess the risks of the effects of climate change, on our assets, on our infrastructure, so that we can better plan for the future. And I think a positive development is within our industry. One of our associations, EEI, is actually helping to coordinate an effort across utilities to provide information to investors. And it's been a really positive dialogue to better understand the type of metrics and qualitative information they're looking for, developing some templates so that we're providing information in a more standardized way, so it's easier for them to find the information that they're looking for, and it's just been a really positive development.
A lot of questions around future demand and Exxon's energy outlook projecting a 25% increase in oil and gas sales over the next 20 years. And so one of the questions is how effective, and maybe the policy folks here on the panel can talk about this, how effective will a tax be on really reducing emissions and driving down demand for carbon-intensive energy, given some of the projections that you put out there?
Well, I think to answer that question, I think we need to be sort of level set about the realities of energy transitions, right? I mean, there have been energy transitions or evolutions in the past. The energy system is always evolving. It usually happens, it doesn't happen overnight. So when our company is looking out at future demand scenarios, and we see demand rising, we're maybe not surprising, but we're right in the middle of our forecast with other, whether it's other companies or the International Energy Agency or the U.S. government. So it's not, I think there's maybe a temptation on some to say, well, of course ExxonMobil would say that because that's what they sell, but you don't have to take our word for it. You can look at what other third parties are saying about increased demand. A carbon tax it certainly would have an effect on demand, and the questions around it become fundamentally sort of political questions, which is there are lots of products that there are no easy immediate substitutes for, right? So if you own a gasoline vehicle, you might not be able to immediately go and buy an electric vehicle overnight, but the fleet may change and shift over time. Or look at fuel sources for electricity generation. Maybe coal starts to get backed out a little more quickly, and it goes to nuclear or to natural gas or more renewables or whatever it may be. But these are not sort of overnight. This is not a problem that's going to be solved overnight. As somebody on the previous panel mentioned, this is a long-term problem that requires solutions that can unfold over time. But the important point about the tax, or putting the tax in place, is, as some other folks have mentioned, is it builds in certainty for business planning purposes, and with respect to the point that Greg was making about if you have a dividend, then maybe you get additional certainty that a regulatory regime wouldn't have. And again, businesses can get very frustrated when they're trying to plan long term, but they might not know 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, what the policy regime is going to look like. So having a clear signal, which right now I would argue there's a national carbon tax or a price on emissions. We don't really know what it is though, because we have this sort of patchwork quilt of regulations, policies, both regionally, federal, and state. Having a clear signal would be advantageous to everybody for planning purposes and for technology adoption going forward.
Telling me we're almost out of time. Okay, got it. So there's some questions about, for all the companies, really around lobbying and how are you weighing in on policy advocacy and at the federal level? Obviously, there's nothing to be voted on right now, but there's a real sense of the long game here, and how do you step out individually from associations and really make your presence known on the Hill? And so I don't know who would like to field that question first, but there were 2 or 3 different questions related to that.
Having flown in from Washington this morning, maybe I'll start with that one. We've been members of several groups, as I said, US CAP, the Clean Energy Group prior to that, and now CLC. I think we've got a lot of education to do. And this is not going to be a near-term game, but we are meeting frequently with Senate offices in particular, Senate Republican offices in particular, and we'll continue to do that. And really, for the first time, Exelon stepped up earlier this year to support a 501c4, Americans for Carbon Dividends. We made $1 million investment in that effort. It's affiliated with CLC to really put some additional impetus behind that project. And so we have former Senators Breaux and Lott working with us on that effort. And so it's not just the individual companies, but we've got the 501c4 behind us as well, working on strategic political activities too.
Anyone else want to comment?
Sure, I'd like to comment. So as part of the Global Sustainability and Foundation, our government affairs team actually sits in the same department. And so we work very, very closely with our government affairs team not only on climate advocacy, but also other federal and state activities. I would also say that, again, I'm going to plug Ceres and Bicep because they've been an amazing partner as we navigate not only at the federal level, but also at the state level to support these policies that will allow for some really good climate policy that will create certainty. And then one thing that hasn't been said that I'd like to say is that along with certainty will come innovation. So we feel that certainly having a tax on carbon will create a lot of innovation in the marketplace. And more than anything, we need to go fast and we need to change quickly.
Ellen, did you want to comment on that at all, in terms of
Sure.
maybe working with your association or stepping out?
Sure. So we work with our Furniture Manufacturers Association, Business and Institutional Furniture Manufacturers Association, BIFMA. And they're also supportive of these concepts of certainly policy efficiency, but looking at the long-term impacts of potentially putting a price on carbon. And I just want to echo what Nick already said, that I would say policy efficiency is so critical for us, and that's what I've heard from our government affairs person, is that in order to operate efficiently, we need policy efficiency. And that's the way that we can bring more value to, our stakeholders. So for us, again, it comes right back to certainty and predictability. We know that we're getting into more extreme weather conditions. We know they might impact our supply chain, et cetera. How can we navigate that and make sure that we're as proactive as we can be?
Just real quick on the sort of talking to policymakers front, I think it was Alex in the earlier panel mentioned that he'd been with something like 70 members of Congress, and only one denier, and everybody saying yes, this is an issue that needs to be dealt with, but the politics of it aren't great for them, and that is something that we need to be eyes wide open about. I mean, we are in a country that was founded in a tax revolt, right? I mean, taxes are four-letter words for a lot of people. So I think one of the things that I do, especially if I'm and my colleagues do, if we're talking with conservative members who are skeptical of taxes, or say, hey, I don't want to be primaried from the right if I come out in support of a carbon tax, I think it's important to remind people that one of the opportunities here, and this is certainly the case in the Climate Leadership Council's proposal, is that you have a suite of regulations that are out there. You could have a reform or modernization of policy broadly, where you put in an efficient, clear policy that's meaningful, and then you sweep away things that are inefficient or maybe high cost and low benefit. So there's an opportunity here. And there are a lot of members who just haven't even thought of it that way. They're just thinking, okay, you're coming in and you're just trying to jam a tax down my throat. Well, no, wait a minute. There's an opportunity here to do, broadly speaking, in the policy realm, something that is much, much better for the country and much, much more meaningful in terms of addressing this challenge.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I think we have to wrap. I'm getting the signal over there. Thank you to the panelists.